I was standing in the cold, gray review office when the decision came down for the 5th time in a row. Denied. Again. I looked at the paper in my hands, and my heart felt like it was sinking into the floor. There was no explanation given, no feedback on how to improve, and no chance to ask questions. There was just a stamp form at the bottom, and the signature on it was one I knew better than my own. It belonged to my father, Colonel Varrick Soltane. He didn't even look up from his desk when I walked into his office later that afternoon. He just kept typing, his face as hard as stone. "You're not ready, Caliph," he said, his voice flat and cold. "You lack the command discipline required for the next rank." I stood there in my crisp uniform, my back straight, wondering how he could say that when I had worked harder than anyone else in my unit. But later that day, an HR clerk pulled me aside in the hallway. She looked around to make sure no one was watching us before she whispered the truth. "This recommendation didn't come from the board," she said quietly. "It came directly from your father's desk." The realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. Every time I had qualified for a promotion over the last few years, it had simply vanished into thin air. I had spent countless nights studying, leading drills, and perfecting my reports, only to have them disappear into a black hole. My direct supervisor always avoided eye contact whenever the promotion lists were posted, and now I finally understood why. They all knew that my father's signature carried a weight that nobody in this building dared to question. If the colonel said I wasn't ready, then the world believed I wasn't ready. I went home that night and stared at my reflection in the mirror, feeling like my entire career was being controlled by a man who was supposed to be my biggest supporter. I started to think back to all the times he had told me I would never rank above him. I used to think it was just a tough way of motivating me, but now I saw it for what it really was, a threat. I decided right then that I couldn't let him sit on my life anymore. I had to find out exactly what he was doing to my records. The pattern was too perfect to be an accident. 3 promotions denied, then 4 and now 5. Every single time, the reason listed was performance review concerns, but I knew that was a lie. I had received top ratings from every field commander I had ever served under. My physical fitness scores were at the top of the chart, and my tactical exams were nearly perfect. Yet, somehow, when it came time for the board to meet, my name was never on the final list. I felt like I was running a race where the finish line kept moving further away every time I got close. I tried to talk to my father about it one more time at dinner, hoping for a shred of honesty, but he just stared at me with those cold, judging eyes. "A Soltane doesn't complain about the process," he snapped. "They endure it." But I was done enduring. I went to the records office the next morning and asked to see my personnel file. The clerk there hesitated, but I had the right to see it. When he finally handed it over, I felt a wave of nausea. My file was missing pieces. I sat in a small, windowless room and began flipping through my official history. Something was very wrong. Entire sections of my file had been rewritten or replaced entirely. My achievements, like the commendation I received for the rescue mission last year, had been minimized to a single, unimportant sentence. On the other hand, small mistakes I had made years ago were exaggerated and highlighted as if they were major failures in my character. My heart pounded against my ribs as I looked at the digital footprints on the documents. Every single edit, every tiny change that made me look incompetent, traced back to the same set of credentials. It was my father's login. He hadn't just been blocking me, he had been actively editing my history to make me look like a failure on paper. He was creating a version of me that didn't exist, a version that was designed to stay exactly where I was. My stomach dropped as I realized he had been sitting in his office, carefully clicking through my life and deleting my hard work. He wasn't just a tough father, he was a saboteur. I knew I couldn't fight a colonel alone, especially not one who was my own father. I needed someone with enough power to look into a high-ranking officer's actions without being intimidated. That was when I decided to contact the office of the Inspector General. It was a terrifying move because if I failed, my career would be over for good. I spent the next 3 days gathering every piece of evidence I could find. I printed out my original commendations, my actual field ratings, and the fake ones my father had created. I made copies of the access logs that showed him entering my file at odd hours of the night. My hands were shaking when I finally walked into the IG's office. I met with an investigator named Major Kalin, who listened to my story with a neutral expression. I told him everything, From the 5 denied promotions to the rewritten history. I showed him the traces of my father's credentials on my digital records. Major Kalen didn't promise me anything, but he took the folder and told me that a formal inquiry would begin immediately. The news of the IG investigation spread through the base like wildfire. My father found out within 24 hours, and the atmosphere at home became unbearable. He didn't yell or scream, he just became even colder, if that was possible. He acted like I had committed the ultimate act of treason against the family. "You've made a very big mistake, Caliph," he said one evening, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You think you can challenge my authority? You're just proving exactly why you aren't ready for command." He tried to act like the investigation was a joke, but I could see the way his eyes darted to his phone every time it rang. He was worried, even if he wouldn't admit it. My mother stayed out of the way, her face full of worry, caught between the man she feared and the daughter she loved. I felt like a stranger in my own house, but for the first time in years I didn't feel weak. I was finally standing up for the truth, and no matter what happened, he couldn't take that away from me. Major Kalen called me into his office a week later. He looked different this time, more focused, more serious. He told me that they had begun a deep dive into my father's digital history, and what they were finding was much larger than just my file. It turned out my father had a long history of managing the careers of people he didn't like, or people he felt threatened by. But he had been especially careful with mine. "He didn't just edit your file, Caliph," Major Kalen said, sliding a document across the desk. "He actually blocked your evaluation packets from even reaching the promotion board." My heart stopped. This meant that for years, the people who were supposed to decide my future never even knew I was an option. They weren't rejecting me, they didn't even know I existed. My father had been acting as a gatekeeper, standing in front of the door and telling me it was locked while he held the key in his pocket. The level of premeditated deception was staggering. He had stolen years of my life and my growth. I went back to work the next day, feeling a strange mix of anger and relief. At least now I knew I wasn't crazy. I wasn't the failure he said I was, but the fight was far from over. My father began using his influence to turn my own unit against me. Suddenly, my subordinates were being questioned about my leadership style, and rumors started circulating that I was only under investigation because I was unstable. It was a classic move. If you can't disprove the evidence, destroy the person presenting it. I had to keep my head down and do my job perfectly, knowing that every move I made was being watched. My father was trying to provoke me into making a mistake, something he could use to prove his point to the IG. He wanted me to break, to cry, or to shout, but I remained as steady as a rock. I realized that the command discipline he claimed I lacked was actually the very thing that was keeping me standing while he tried to tear me down. The investigation moved into its second phase, which involved formal interviews with the officers who served above me. This was the part my father feared the most. Major Kalen interviewed my former field commanders, the ones who had given me those top ratings. When they were asked if they stood by their original evaluations, they all said yes without hesitation. They were confused as to why those ratings hadn't led to a promotion. One of them, a hardened veteran named Colonel Brackett, was reportedly furious when he saw the rewritten version of the file. He told the investigators that the work I had done under his command was some of the best he had seen in 20 years. This was the turning point. When high-ranking officers started questioning my father's integrity, his wall of silence began to crumble. He could ignore a daughter, but he couldn't ignore his peers. The pressure was building, and I could see the cracks forming in his perfect, polished exterior. He was losing his grip on the narrative. One night, I found my father sitting in his study, staring at a blank computer screen. The room was dark, and he looked smaller than I had ever seen him. He didn't hear me come in at first. When he finally looked up, his eyes weren't cold anymore. They were filled with a strange kind of desperation. "I did it for the family name, Caliph," he said, his voice cracking. "I couldn't have you rising too fast and making a mistake that would embarrass us. I was protecting you." I looked at him and realized that he actually believed his own lies. He thought that by holding me back and crushing my spirit, he was doing me a favor. He had confused control with protection for so long that he couldn't tell the difference anymore. I told him that he wasn't protecting me, he was protecting his own ego. He was afraid that if I rose above him, he wouldn't be the center of the world anymore. He didn't have a response for that. He just turned back to his screen, and I walked out of the room. The Inspector General's office finally issued a preliminary report. It was a massive document that detailed every single instance of my father's interference. It showed 64 separate occasions where he had accessed my personnel records without a valid reason. It showed emails he had sent to board members, subtly hinting that I was struggling with personal issues that made me a poor candidate for promotion. He had used a whisper campaign to destroy my chances before I even stood a chance. The report was a roadmap of a man's obsession with power. Major Kalin informed me that because of the severity of the findings, the case was being escalated to a full administrative review board. My father was no longer just being looked at, he was being held accountable. The base commander was notified, and for the first time in his career, Colonel Varrick Soltane was under the microscope. The hunter had officially become the hunted. I felt a sense of justice, but also a deep sadness for the relationship we could have had. The administrative review was held in a large, formal room that felt like a courtroom. My father sat on one side, flanked by his lawyers, while I sat on the other with Major Kalin. There were 3 high-ranking generals sitting at the front, their faces unreadable. This was the moment of truth. One by one, the evidence was presented. The digital logs, the intercepted emails, and the testimonies from my commanders were all laid out for the board to see. My father's lawyers tried to argue that he was simply exercising his parental and professional judgment, but the board wasn't interested in excuses. They wanted to know why he had broken the rules and manipulated the system. Every time they asked him a direct question, he gave a vague, military answer, trying to hide behind his rank. But the generals didn't care about his rank. They cared about the integrity of the service. I watched as my father's face turned from red to a pale, ghostly white. He was realizing that his stars wouldn't save him this time. The most shocking moment of the review came when the board played a recorded audio file that had been recovered from my father's office computer. It was a recording of a private meeting he had with a promotion board member 2 years ago. In the recording, my father's voice was clear and unmistakable. "My daughter is a fine soldier, but she's not ready for the responsibility," he said. "Do me a favor and keep her where she is for another year. I'll make sure it's worth your while." There was a collective gasp in the room. This was direct proof of a quid pro quo, a bribe. He hadn't just used his influence, he had used his power to corrupt the entire process. The general at the center of the board looked at my father with pure disgust. "Colonel Soltane, you have not only failed your daughter, but you have failed the uniform," he said. I felt a tear run down my face, not for me, but for the man my father had become. He had traded everything for a sense of control. After the recording was played, my father's lawyers requested an immediate recess. The room cleared out, and I found myself standing in the hallway, leaning against the wall for support. My mother came up to me, her eyes red from crying. She didn't say anything. She just took my hand and squeezed it. It was the first time she had shown me any public support since the investigation began. We stood there in silence for a few minutes, 2 women who had been living in the shadow of a powerful man for far too long. I realized that this wasn't just my victory, it was hers, too. She had been a victim of his control in her own way, and now that control was finally being broken. When we went back into the room, the atmosphere was even heavier. My father wouldn't even look in our direction. He looked like a man who was already mourning his own career. He knew the end was coming, and there was nothing left for him to do but wait for the hammer to fall. The board didn't take long to reach a decision. They ruled that my father had committed multiple acts of professional misconduct, fraud, and obstruction of justice. They recommended that he be stripped of his command immediately and that his case be referred for further disciplinary action. But the part that mattered the most to me was what they said next. They ordered a full and immediate correction of my personnel records. They stated that my promotions had been illegally suppressed and that I was to be promoted to the rank I should have achieved years ago, effective immediately. I would also receive back pay and a formal apology from the department. I stood there, trembling, as the words sank in. I was finally, officially, being recognized for my hard work. I wasn't just Caliph, the colonel's daughter anymore. I was Major Caliph Soltane. I looked at my father, and for a split second, I saw a flash of something in his eyes. Maybe it was regret, or maybe it was just the realization that he couldn't stop me. The transition was fast. Within 48 hours, my father was cleaned out of his office. I watched from a distance as he carried a single box of his belongings to his car. He didn't have an escort, and no one stopped to shake his hand or wish him well. He was a man who had burned every bridge he had ever built. On the same day, I received my new rank insignia. I sat in my room and looked at the new bars, feeling a sense of accomplishment that I had never known. But it was bittersweet. I had won my career, but I had lost the only father I had. I realized that our relationship would never be the same, and maybe it never should be. He had shown me who he really was, and I had shown him that I was stronger than his lies. I spent the evening calling my former commanders to thank them for their support. They all sounded genuinely happy for me, and for the first time, I felt like I truly belonged in the officer corps. A few weeks later, I was assigned to a new unit at a different base. It was a fresh start, a place where no one knew my father and no one cared about my last name. I worked harder than ever, not to prove him wrong, but to prove myself right. I found that without his shadow hanging over me, I was more creative, more confident, and a better leader. My subordinates responded to my style with loyalty and hard work. I realized that my father was wrong about everything. I didn't lack command discipline. I had been suppressed by it. I started a mentorship program for junior officers who felt like their careers were being stalled by unfair leadership. I wanted to make sure that no one else had to go through what I did. I felt like I was finally living the life I was meant to live. I was no longer a variable in someone else's plan. I was the architect of my own future. My mother eventually moved out of my father's house and came to live near my new base. We spent a lot of time talking about the past and the way things were. She told me that she had known about some of his actions, but was too afraid to speak up. "I'm so proud of you, Caliph," she said one evening over dinner. "You did what I could never do." We were both healing in our own ways. My father tried to call a few times, but I wasn't ready to speak to him yet. He was still bitter, still blaming the system for his downfall. He hadn't learned the lesson he needed to learn. But I didn't hate him anymore. I just felt pity for him. He was a man who had everything and threw it all away because he couldn't stand the idea of his daughter being his equal. I realized that the greatest promotion I ever received wasn't the rank on my shoulders. It was the freedom in my heart. The Inspector General's office eventually released a final report on the entire investigation. It became a case study in military ethics used to train future officers on the dangers of nepotism and personal bias. My name was redacted, of course, but everyone in my circle knew the story. It served as a reminder that the truth always finds a way out, no matter how much power someone uses to hide it. I received a letter from the general who had sat on the review board. He thanked me for my courage and told me that my actions had helped to clean up a system that had been broken for too long. He said that the service was better because I was in it. I kept that letter in a frame on my desk, a reminder of the day I decided to fight for myself. I knew that I had a long career ahead of me, and I was excited for every challenge it would bring. I often think back to that first day in the Gray Review office, when I felt like the world was ending. If I could go back and talk to that version of myself, I would tell her to hang on. I would tell her that she was stronger than she knew and that the truth was worth the fight. My father had tried to use the military to crush me, but in the end, it was the military that saved me. The system he thought he owned was the very thing that held him accountable. I realized that rank is just a number, but character is what defines a leader. I strive every day to be the kind of officer my father never was: honest, fair, and dedicated to the success of those under my command. My story isn't just about a promotion, it's about the power of the human spirit to rise above betrayal. And as I look at my new rank in the mirror, I know that I didn't just earn it, I won it. My father's final disciplinary hearing resulted in his forced retirement at a reduced rank. It was a public humiliation for a man who lived for his reputation. He moved to a small town far away and dropped out of the military community entirely. I heard through the grapevine that he spends most of his time alone now, still refusing to admit he did anything wrong. It's a sad end for a man who had such a distinguished career, but it was an end he chose for himself. I hope that one day he can find some peace, but I know that I can't be the one to give it to him. He has to find it on his own. I decided to move forward and focus on my own life and my own family. I have a community of friends and colleagues who respect me for who I am, and that is more valuable than any rank or title. My career continued to flourish at my new base. I was given more responsibility and led several successful missions that earned me praise from my new commanders. I felt like I was finally in the flow of my life, moving at the pace I was always meant to move. I realized that my father's interference had actually made me a better officer in the long run. Because I had to work twice as hard to stay afloat, I had developed a level of skill and resilience that my peers didn't have. I was more prepared for the challenges of command because I had already faced the greatest challenge of all, fighting my own blood for my right to exist. I was grateful for the lessons I had learned, even if the teacher was cruel. I felt like I was finally at peace with my past, and I was looking forward to my future with open eyes. 1 year after the investigation ended, I was invited to speak at the graduation ceremony for a group of new officers. I stood on the stage and looked out at the sea of eager faces, and I felt a sense of pride that I couldn't describe. I told them my story, not as a victim, but as a victor. I told them that their character was their most important asset and that they should never let anyone, not even those they love, stand in the way of their potential. I told them to be the kind of leaders who lift others up instead of holding them down. When I finished, the room was silent for a moment before erupting into a standing ovation. I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't expected. My story was no longer a source of pain, it was a source of inspiration. I was finally, completely, free from my father's shadow. I still have my old personnel file, the one with my father's edits. I keep it in a drawer as a reminder of how far I've come. Sometimes I look at it and marvel at the lengths he went to just to keep me in my place. It seems so small and petty now, compared to the life I have. I've learned that the only person who can truly block your promotion is you, by giving up on your dreams. As long as you keep fighting for what's right, there is no wall high enough to keep you back. I am Major Varrick Soltane, and I am a leader of character. I am a daughter of a fallen colonel, but I am also a woman of my own making. And that is a rank that no one can ever take away from me. I am proud of the person I have become, and I am ready for whatever comes next. As the sun sets over the base today, I stand on the parade ground and listen to the bugle call. It's a sound that has defined my life for as long as I can remember. But today it sounds different. It doesn't sound like a call to endure, it sounds like a call to lead. I look at the soldiers standing in formation, and I feel a deep sense of responsibility to each and every one of them. I will be the leader they deserve. I will be the officer my father could have been. I am moving forward, one step at a time, into a future that is bright and full of possibility. My father tried to write my ending, but I decided to write a new beginning instead. And as the final notes of the bugle fade away, I know that I am exactly where I am supposed to be. I am whole, I am strong, and I am finally rising. Without his permission,